On behalf of Shannon McCracken, our CEO and the Board of Nonprofit Alliance, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Forward Leading, frank conversation about systemic racism and how to prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion. My name is David Whitehead, and I am the chair of the TNPA board, and we are excited to have you here. In October of last year, TNPA held a leadership summit in Tucson where a very powerful conversation commenced on the nonprofit sector's lack of progress in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Powerful stories were shared, and it was then that TNPA began its journey with DEI. The first step we took was to educate ourselves. We hired Wes Combs, an expert in the field, and formed a subcommittee to understand DEI's impact on the nonprofit sector and TNPA's potential role as a sector leader. I'd like to thank you, Wes Combs, who I believe is on the phone. We established a vision, a mission, and began to plan a path forward. And then COVID-19 hit and disrupted all of our lives. We quickly made adjustments to our rollout plan. Then George Floyd was killed, which gave us all a painful reminder how important DEI is for the sector, to TNPA, and our efforts to move toward a more just nation. While we remain committed to the principles of DEI and its role in creating better industry, we recognize there are significant challenges and implications and how work will happen in the new normal. And so with today's session, we hope to accomplish a few things. We hope to set the context about the challenge ahead of us, initial thinking on how we see TNPA's role and how we will support it. We want to provide a case study example of the marathon versus the sprint that DEI is. And we want to provide you with some resources to help you further your goals or just to get you started. I have the pleasure to introduce two remarkable leaders in the sector and our panelists for today that will lead this frank conversation. Jennifer Valenzuela brings nearly 20 years of experience building and supporting teams in the healthcare sector to her role at Health Leads, where she oversees the organization's people, culture, and equity strategy. Health Leads develops programs, technologies, and interventions to enable healthcare communities and government organizations share resources and improve social needs interventions. At Health Leads, she has also led clinical program implementation and integration at health systems and clinics nationwide. Prior to Health Leads, Jennifer served as director of the Young Parents Program at Boston Children's Hospital, a multidisciplinary clinic dedicated to working with teen mothers and fathers. And as a licensed independent clinical social worker, Jennifer also worked in the emergency departments at a number of hospital systems. Holds a BS from Portland State University and a Master's of Public Health and Master's of Social Work from Boston University. Jen is based in Boston and was originally planned to join us for the diversity, equity, and inclusion discussion at our April conference. And Jen, we are so pleased you could be here today. My dear friend and colleague, Tycely Williams, has inspired individuals and institutions to invest more than $92 million in charitable causes. She is currently the Chief Development Officer with America's Promise Alliance, and over the past 23 years, Tycely advanced philanthropy at YWCA USA, American Red Cross National Capital Region, and YMCA of Metropolitan Washington. In her spare time, she chairs the Board of Trustees for Monument Academy Public Charter School and volunteers with numerous youth-serving organizations. Tycely is a certified fundraising executive, past president of the Association of Fundraising Professionals, Washington, D.C. Metro Chapter, and the immediate past chair of the Women's Impact Initiative of the Association of Fundraising Professionals. She is a founding member of the Nonprofit Alliance and board chair of the Nonprofit Alliance Foundation. So thank you, Tycely. Thank you, Jennifer, for both being here. With that, Tycely, I'm going to hand it over to you.
David, I want to thank you. I know I can speak for Jen in extending our appreciation. Thank you for warmly introducing us. We want to also extend gratitude to Wes and all of those individuals who have given us their time and attention today. We're going to do our very best, David, to actualize the manner in which the Nonprofit Alliance and our foundation will help our members in the sector at large better understand the importance and the need to put into practice strategies and tactics that propel diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I would like to take this opportunity to just begin with creating some shared understanding around diversity, equity, and inclusion. For many of us within the not-for-profit space, we are looking and seeking opportunities to position our mission and vision so that it aligns with our values. I think it's become really, really evident as the unfortunate issues have unfolded in our country that no matter which area you focus in on within the not-for-profit space, whether it's human services, whether it's the environment, that we all value diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're hoping by sharing with you a little bit how we within the TNPA, how we are actually actualizing these things, that you will be able to glean some lessons and lift some possible insights on how you may do the same within your organization. I want to start by making sure that we all know that very soon we will have publicly facing on our website our DEI vision and mission. I want to introduce the words because I think it'll kind of. So within the Nonprofit Alliance, our vision statement is the nonprofit sector and support needed, aspiring to ensure that we are creating a world that values all stakeholders, everyone. Yes.
Tyson, your audio is dragging a little bit. We're losing you a little bit. Do you want us to, do you want to find another spot? And I'd be happy to share our mission and vision and while you relocate.
That will be great, Shannon. If you can take the mission and vision, I will circle right back.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tyson. And hello, everyone. I'm Shannon McCracken with the Nonprofit Alliance. And as Tyson started to share, we actually just today put up our diversity, equity, and inclusion page on our website. And this has been work that has long been coming, and we invite you to go to our site and look for this. Our website is tnpa.org, and then under the About Us navigation at the top, you can find the new page. This is the starting point, right? Just as we as TNPA are starting our journey with DEI, this page is our starting point for the resources that we'll be including on our website and sharing with you as time goes by. So you can see a little bit of the background, the journey so far for us, which David alluded to. And then you can, at the bottom of the page, see our mission and vision. Our vision is that the nonprofit sector reflects the diversity of the communities it serves, values all stakeholders regardless of their background, and provides everyone the same opportunities and support needed to grow. It's helpful to know that in the TNPA mission statement, we talk about promoting, protecting, and strengthening the philanthropic sector. And we pulled those three verbs into our mission statement for our DEI initiative as well. So promotes, TNPA will advocate for a fully diverse, inclusive, an equitable nonprofit sector through authentic stakeholder engagement and accountability for achieving outcomes. Protects. TNPA will identify barriers and promote sustainable solutions. And strengthen. Provides education and resources needed to foster DEI excellence. This is our stake in the ground and where we are beginning as TNPA to support the community and be part of the community. We're not coming here pretending we have all the answers by any stretch. We are learning and growing and improving as well, and are excited to join you on this very thoughtful and intentional journey. I know Tysely is going to be coming back and joining us. Oh, there she is, right on cue.
Hi, friends. Is this any better?
It is right now. And you know what, Tysely, I'll hand the baton back to you. And if we have any issues again, I'll pop back on screen.
All righty. Shannon, I want to thank you for that wonderful introduction to our mission and our values. And I also want to just build upon the verb. We are really hoping that today's session is going to be one that inspires you to take action. We are going to have an opportunity to learn firsthand from an industry leader who found herself working to champion diversity, equity, and inclusion. And she is actually going to step into a safe space, share some lessons learned, and to help us give thought to how we move forward in the current state, demonstrating to our stakeholders, both internally and externally, our commitment to creating a culture that is working with intentionality to eliminate systemic racism. We will begin by acknowledging that this is a very heavy and a very hard topic. Many individuals, because of their lived experience, have had to deal with systemic racism at work, at home, in places of worship, and throughout their lives. We want to ensure that the role that we play as employers and the role that we play shepherding charitable efforts is one that is sensitive to the ills of systemic racism. And we want to ensure that we are putting forth our commitment to strategies and tactics that are intentionally working to reshape systems that have propelled racism. Want to bring to everyone's attention the chat function. So while we are going to do our best to make this engaging, we're going to do so by relying on the chat function. I am shortly going to introduce Jen, or turn it over to Jen. David has already done an excellent introduction. But as you're listening to Jen, if you have questions, we encourage you to use the chat box. And after Jen has introduced, created a foundation by which we can build the conversation from, we will open it up and have an interactive exchange. So with that, I want to turn it over to a professional who is well equipped to help us delicately have really helpful, transparent, and open conversations about the ills of racism. Jen, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Tysely. So just as a warning, you might be hearing the soundtrack of my home, which is my son laughing in the background of some video he's watching, and my dog that is very protective of our home. So I apologize ahead of time. I can't stop those. But thank you, Tysely, for being a part of this. Tysely, Wes, David, Shannon, for inviting me. I come today with full transparency. And so my plan today is to talk with you about the journey at my organization, Health Leads. I'll talk about that in a minute. and really be open and honest about what this journey has been for us over the last, I'm going to talk a little bit about the last eight-ish years. And if you have questions, fantastic, please put those in the chat box. And then also, I challenge the audience to, if you have thoughts, comments, doesn't necessarily have to be a question, but put it out there. Like, I think sometimes the dialogue that can happen has to come from people's curiosity. And as long as it comes with the intent to learn and to grow, then I'm all for having hard conversations and have the conversations that it takes to move us forward. So thanks again for letting me be here. I'm going to share with you the journey my organization has taken. If there's anything that you walk away with from this conversation, I hope it's two things. One, I want you to see the complexity of this work and understand there's just no checkbox that you get to mark off on the list. It is not a linear progression. It is a journey. It's a marathon. And then number two, leadership matters. The top people in an organization must prioritize this work for progress to be made. And if that doesn't happen, change isn't going to happen. And so you'll hear themes of that come out throughout these next 10, 15 minutes. And so if you are one of the leaders at your organization, I hope you take some notes of how you have either been reflecting on how you have been showing up in ways that are needed, or maybe how you haven't, and maybe there's some change that needs to happen. So before I jump into that journey, I want to introduce you to my organization. So it's Health Leads. David mentioned it a little bit, but I think it's important to understand the work that we were doing to be able to understand like why we felt like we had to make this journey over the last years. So I work at an organization called Health Leads. We're an innovation hub that pursues both national and local initiatives to address the deep societal roots of racial inequity that impact health. So we were founded in 1996 as a nonprofit by a white Harvard woman who did amazing work to grow our organization, but that culture had continued on in our organization as we were moving through our DEI culture and our journey. Our work starting from 1996 really up until about 2018 was helping set the standard for health systems and health clinics to look how to figure out how do they integrate programs that connect people to essential resources, things like food and heat and housing. And so the term you may have heard before is social determinants of health. And so we were working with these health systems thinking about how do I integrate that workflow and my workforce and leadership, and how do we figure out how to do this work in patient care. Talking about homelessness or food insecurity, that just wasn't the norm in the health system 20 years ago. It is more so now, and we're really happy and excited to see that that's happening. But what we know is we would still be doing the same things 10 to 20 years out, helping families access individual food pantries or homeless shelters, because the systemic issues that are happening are not about an individual's choice to be without housing or to be food insecure. It's our systems that need adjustments. And so Health Leads over the last couple of years has really said, we need to go further upstream, and we actually need to start thinking about the systems that are preventing our people from being able to live a healthy well-being and with dignity. So our journey in the diversity, equity, and inclusion work has been quite long and hard. But as I talk about this journey, I want to repeat that this is not a linear progression. So I'm a runner. Most of the time, I take breaks and my mileage every week fluctuates. I go up, I go down. When COVID started, I stopped for about a month or two. But I consider myself a runner. And so just like I consider myself a runner, I also see myself as a student and an activist of equity and racial justice. But that path also fluctuates like it does with running. And so we aren't running the Boston Marathon course. So what you see on the left is a really linear straight shot. You start 26.2 miles away from the city, and then you just keep moving forward until you hit that finish line in Boston on Boylston Street. I think, though, this DEI journey is more like London, where you just see lots of zigs and zags and forward progression, and then all of a sudden you start going backwards, and then you're going up and you're going down. And so it just, you kind of never quite know where you're going. And as a runner, it's nice to see straight ahead of you of like, okay, that's my destination. And it's hard when you don't know where the finish line is going to be. And that's how I see this DEI journey. So we're gonna talk over the years of what we've done. And what this here shows is just how we've even talked about our DEI work. It's had multiple different iterations and names over the years. And so I'm gonna share what that looked like. So 2012, that was when we first declared that having a diversity committee was important. But what that meant, no one really knew, because there was no declaration made around what our organization stood for. Our staff was confused as they heard contradicting messages from leadership. On one hand, they said there's a commitment to equity, but then behind closed doors, we couldn't get funding approved to do things like having patients around the table with us as an advisory council. We couldn't do trainings and bring dollars in for that. And at one point, we were told explicitly that a diversity-specific role, that we didn't want to hire that, because the thinking then was if we hired a specific person, then what that feels like is we're compartmentalizing the work, or we're isolating the job of racial equity, and we want it to be holistic and have it be spread across. But what we all know, I think what happens is when you don't have an identified person leading a charge and your leadership backing that up, is that when there's no funding, no prioritization, nothing happens. It just fizzles because your staff gets busy doing all of the work that they're getting paid to do on a day-to-day basis. At that time in 2012, we were about 12 to 15% Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And at one point, I remember, like, there's memories that are blazed in my mind over the years that I've been here. And this one is very clear for me. The head of HR told me, she leaned forward at me, we were at our all-staff retreat, and she said, you know, Jen, I don't know why people are so upset about our diversity numbers. Look at us, we're totally diverse. And it was our all-staff retreat, and that really crushed me, because as a Latina and in this organization and really pushing the organization for a long time, it just felt like, wow, you don't see the value behind having, and diversity for you is very different than what diversity for me is. I tried to find, I know I've seen statistics before out there that if you ask a white person what a diverse organization looks like, I think the percentage around 15 to 20% is what a white person might consider diverse. If you ask a person of color, it needs to be around 70% POC for you to consider the organization to be diverse. So even your perspective is very different depending on who you are and how you look at this. But in 2012, we were really proud of ourselves. We hired 3 people of color into the executive levels. That was a really big deal from an organization that was mostly white, mostly female, and mostly Ivy League educated. I was one of the few people that came in from a state school education, and that was tough. But our priority at that time was numbers. It was numbers of hires and how many people of color that we could hire. And so that was our focus. We focused on our hiring practices, and then we did a few seminars here and there. So fast forward to 2014, and Eric Gardner was killed in July. And then it continued when Michael Brown was killed in August and Ferguson erupted. But you wouldn't have known it in the hallways of health leads because there was silence met with that. There was no conversation around it. There was no acknowledgement that Black people were being killed by police, and that there was no justice for these folks. So, and as I was preparing for this talk, I really gone through the archives and looked at old emails, and we have a weekly all staff email that goes out, newsletter. And so I've just been kind of pulling through those for the last 8 years. And I found one, so mind you, this was the summer of 2014 when Eric Garner and Michael Brown were killed. I found an email in October that had one line mentioned about this. And that said, our Diversity and Inclusion Committee has been discussing important news topics like what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, and how it affects our work, and discussing how the diversity plays into our volunteers' experience and training. So at that time, we had about 800 volunteers in our organization, but we also had about 75 staff. And so when that one sentence came out and talked about how this was impacting our volunteers, there was no mention to the impact of the staff. And more specifically, there was no mention about the impact of our Black staff. And I can only imagine like how you wouldn't feel seen if your organization was having conversations like that. So December of that same, and that was the only conversation that I could find anywhere and that anybody can remember. I've also been talking with some staff who have been around for years, and I've kind of tried to put together a timeline, and there was no recollection of anything else that happened. So December of that same year, one person spoke up and said, hey, I've heard conversations happening off to the side. I think we need to have a dialogue about this. I think staff want to share and they want to come together. And so, but she had to approach it very cautiously. Like she did it individually, one by one. And then she had a private email with a group of us that she felt like were behind this. And then she had to go to our CEO and one of our VP that ran HR at that time to ask if it would be okay. She got permission. And then it became an optional conversation that was having. And so, the outcome of that, there was a nice summary that came out in our newsletter that I was talking about, but that was it. That was all that happened. So the theme that happened for our organization was often there would be one thing that would happen, there would be unrest, everybody would talk about it, we would commit to it as an organization that we were going to do something, and then nothing would happen. So we have annual staff retreats, and often at those staff retreats, at least one of the agenda items would be around diversity, inclusion, equity. The words changed, but it was always the same type of topic. And the same thing would always happen. We would really get fired up about it, and then there was never any follow through. So our turning point was really in 2015 when we hired a consulting agency. And that turning point, I don't mean that we were moving forward. We actually went back pretty far when we hired that consulting agency. We totally crashed and burned. We had an executive sponsor at our organization that sponsored this body of work. The DEI agency came in, they did an assessment of our organization, they had focus groups with our staff, they talked with just our staff of color, they talked to our LGBTQ staff, they talked to different levels of our staff, and they came back and they did the findings, and they said, like, here are some of the things that we're seeing here. What happened is those findings fell on deaf ears because the way it was presented to the organization did not align with the way we delivered information in our organization. So our organization is really hot on PowerPoint slides, and less text is better. And this organization came in with text-heavy slides where it was just like 50 bullet points on one slide that we were supposed to read while we were listening. And it was this just 1 hour lecture basically that we had. But I don't blame that agency. I actually blame our executive sponsor. I don't believe they were set up to be successful in our organization. I don't believe there was true value put in behind the work. And I think there was a time where they felt like they had to just do this and go through the motions. But to me now, as I work as an executive sponsor, my role is to stand up next to the work, next to the people that are running it, and to be in conviction with it. And we didn't have that from our leadership at that time. But after that, we then did internal trainings. We did our own stuff. We said, okay, we can do this better than anyone else. And so we tried to do our own. We did these internal dialogues that we called Let's Get Real. The purpose of that was to have difficult and uncomfortable conversations with how we tagged them. And I think it moved the needle slightly, but I would say our white staff definitely got more out of them than our Black and Indigenous people of color got out of it. I know many of us walked out of those dialogues and was like, that was a little whack. Fast forward, we hired a new head of HR, and we thought she was going to save the day and she was going to move us forward. But again, it's really hard to make changes when the barriers are at the top level of your organization. She did get funding. We got a new role that was developed. That was our Director of Equity and Inclusion. And at that same time, we also had some shift of executive leadership where we had three people specifically that came in. One was equity was front in mind. He came from working in the HIV world in California and really felt like this is something that our organization has to be talking about and has to be living and working on. And our other executive level person that came on was a white male who I think probably that was some of the first times he was ever talking about race. And he had an open mind, he was willing to learn, and he also was the first person that put identified dollars in our budgets where we were really being able to make action on things. That same year, we had a data analyst, so this was how some of our dollars were spent. We hired somebody who focuses on equity and analyzing the data of your staffing patterns. And so she looked at our hiring, our firing, and our promotions. And what she found at that time was that our white staff were being promoted much more than our staff of color. But what the really interesting piece behind that was that the types of promotions they were getting were different. So our white staff were being promoted in what some people might call like in-place promotion, where a manager comes and says, this person's doing excellent, I think she needs to move up. We're going to create another title for her. She's going to get higher, better benefits. And it was basically just a slide up into that new position. There was no effort that had to be done to get that. Sometimes people were complaining like I deserve to get to the next level, and oftentimes like that worked in our org. Our Black, Indigenous, and people of color staff, what was happening for them is they typically were, when they moved up a level, it was because they had applied to an open position that was in our organization, and they had to go through the hiring process, they had to be interviewed, and then they were chosen to be in that role. And so there was an active work that person had to do to say, hey, I'm ready for the next level, I want to do that. And so that was really striking, and that for me was a big moment as I remember when that data was presented, and I had a huge emotional reaction to it, physical reaction, like emotional reaction, and so that was a big place for us on our management team, and to talk about like what's happening, why are we doing this? So we changed our hiring practices, we prioritized where before a panel of candidates could be presented to a hiring manager, at least half of the pool had to be people of color. And so it might have taken us longer to get that pool, but we wanted to wait until we had full representation. It wasn't that there aren't people out there to fill these roles. It was that this urgency or feel that you have to fill the spot immediately meant that you couldn't do really intentional recruiting to find people to fill spots. But we also had to work on our internal culture too, because you can bring people in, but if you have a culture that's unwelcoming, then they're not going to want to stay and they're going to leave. We had some internal incidents that happened. We had some pretty racially charged incidents where a Black woman and a Filipino woman received an anonymous letter from a coworker saying that the only reason they received promotions was because the color of their skin. It caused some major divides in our organization. It tore us apart. It took us a long time to recover from that. And there were mistakes made at the leadership level. Our CEO was new. She had just come into this role like 3 months before that. So we transitioned CEOs. And she admitted though, like we've failed in some of this and we're going to do better. Later that year, we had our all staff retreat and we committed 2 days to, with an organization called REI, Racial Equity Institute, and they came in and helped us unlearn some of the history that you learn in school, or for some it was just relearning things that they've already heard in their history. But it really was focused on the tragic history that our country has imparted on Black people, and so that also was really important for us to feel like you've got to know your history and know where your country has been and why the laws have been created the way they have, why the medical system is set up the way it is, you've got to understand that to see like why we are where we are today. And so over these last 3 years, we've hired more people to come in. We continue doing trainings pretty regularly. And then we also are constantly looking at our policies. We're having dialogue, we're adjusting things. We had a reduction in force, we had some layoffs, and we did things different in that layoff than we had done when we had another layoff years prior, where we really looked at who was being laid off and what were the reasons behind that, and making sure it wasn't just like we felt was a good fit, but actually had the skill set and created the representation that we needed and wanted across this organization. Just last year, our Black staff told us that their experience was still painful, and it still wasn't feeling like they were getting equal treatment by managers. There was feeling that they were having less opportunities for professional development. It was feeling like they were having more micromanagement from managers. And so they came and said, we want change. We did our own survey. This is what our findings are. Listen to this, change some things. And so we've been working this past year on, we're doing a series right now on coaching for managers. And then we also did a series with the organization on feedback and how to give feedback in a more objective way. So we're continuing on that journey. We're continuing to do the systems improvement. This year, after George Floyd's murder, the response was different than it was back with Ferguson. So we didn't mandate an all-hour call. We recognized it immediately with an all-staff email of what was happening in our country. And that week, after the unrest started and the murder happened, we had 2 opportunities for our staff to come together. It was optional, and so people could come if they want, but they didn't have to. We had some staff that wanted to process together and some that just was like, I don't want to do this with my colleagues. I want to do this with my family and my friends. We talked explicitly about racism and the pain that Black people were feeling for centuries, and how did that also roll into our organization. We also have affinity groups. And it just so happened that our Black affinity group was meeting that week as well. And they had 100% attendance, where all of our Black staff attended that affinity group, and they were able to be together and support one another. And that was just really luck that we had systems in place to be able to address things in different ways how our staff needed it. We haven't been perfect. I know we could still do better. And I also know that we're doing better than we were 6 years ago. We're about to start our next chapter. So our CEO wrote a blog last week, and she called out the tension she feels when she's trying to fight systemic racism. She talked about our board of directors, she talked about our funders, she talked about our partners, and this really delicate balance of pushing to make systems change. She's got a lot of feedback from that blog that she wrote, but she felt really committed to saying what it is out there and how hard this is. She also talked about us being an anti-racist organization and doing anti-racist work. And I don't believe we have a clear understanding of what that means to be doing anti-racist work. I think that's our next chapter at Health Leads, is that we need to be able to figure out what does that mean for us? What does that look like in action? And what's that next mile going to be for us? So we started conversations like 2 weeks ago at our executive team and then our leadership team, to really talk about, we need to start talking about this, and we need to start mapping out our next mile and figuring out how we're going to get there. So I know we're going to have more trainings. I know we're going to have more dialogue. I know we're going to have different policies. I know we're going to be doing more analysis, but that's the work that we need to do. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what these next miles will be for us. Thank you.
Jen, that was.
Oh, I also.
Please go
Thanks,
ahead.
Tysley. I did want to make sure you guys saw this. If you sometimes, being able to read something, this is a thing that you can find easily by Googling "awake to woke to work," and it just has some ideas and suggestions for if you're trying to think about that. So I encourage you to take a look at this. So okay, Tysley, sorry about that.
Jen, thank you. You have done an excellent job demonstrating how to promote, protect, and strengthen commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've got a few questions coming in, Jen, to the chat box. And before we do that, though, I wanted to introduce a perspective from a professor at Georgetown as it pertains to what it means to be anti-racist. As I heard you speak to lessons learned, I really appreciated the way in which you introduce the role and the responsibility that we have as leaders within our cultures that we create at work. And when I use the word culture, Jen, what I mean is that our beliefs in some way influence our behavior. And our employees come to work and they deduce things from what they see, from what they hear, as it pertains to not only what the organization values, but the manner in which the organization actualizes on its values, its mission, and its vision. And as a Black person who has predominantly worked in white dominant cultures, I could so empathize with you reflecting back on seeing people come to work and not hearing individuals at work speak to things that people in the Black community talk about in places of worship. They talk about in their homes. They're grappling with the pain. And yet you step into a place of worship, a place of employment, and people have zero either understanding and or they're not giving voice or attention to what is the most prevalent and possibly one of the most important issues of the day for you. And so I know that there have been many times as a Black person where I've walked into a white dominant culture at work and I'm just wondering, like, are we even on the same planet? It is been very interesting as things have unfolded, in particularly with George Floyd, because this is the first time over the 23 years that I have worked in the not-for-profit sector where I have heard white people talking about the things that Black people talk about. And so I would love to get your thoughts and perspective. We have someone who had a specific question about your founder's culture. And if you could talk a little bit about how your founder's culture manifested itself so that those of us on the webinar, that we can learn a little bit about how the systems were created. I think the other piece, Jen, that you spoke to when you talked about the implications within your health concentration. So if you could just give us a little feedback on that, and would love to hear your thoughts with the current anti-racist. There are many multi-dimensions and aspects to racism. And so if you can just speak a little bit to your founder's culture and share with us anything that you think may be relevant. And then we'd love to get your thoughts on how to create a safe space, but turn it over to you.
Okay, that was big. So the founders culture, so our organization is what's called like a social entrepreneur nonprofit. And so the whole purpose of our organization is to change a sector. Your organization is not necessarily meant to do direct service or to do advocacy. It's you see a problem within a sector and then you figure out like, how can we make an impact on this and actually change an entire sector. And so ours was healthcare, actually focusing on health, which we believed was housing and food and all of those pieces connected to it, and getting away from a sick care system and actually creating health for people. And so I think the founders culture, so what I have learned is that over the years is that this is pretty common and prevalent among organizations where the founder comes in. There's deep attachment to the work when this is your baby. And so we actually used to do this exercise called commitment versus attachment. And how do you know if you're attached to something or if you're committed to something? And the attachment was often talked about as like, if you're attached, maybe you're not making better decisions. than if you're just committed. And so I think in that culture, the way it was that helped build the organization to the amazing org that it has become worked for her, for the organization for the first 15 years. It worked for some. I would say it didn't work for all, right? And so it didn't work for me. But I stayed because I was truly committed to the work that we were doing. But for folks that were in that organization where the work wasn't as much of a passion for them, they were like, I'm out. I don't need to put up with this. And I think I just took on some like a stupid complex that I felt like I needed to stick around for some of the things that we were doing. But I do think in that founder, you stay with what works for you. There's no reason to change. There was a lot of fighting against people when they wanted to open people's eyes to there's problems. Our volunteers were having struggles. They were having different experiences. So I don't know if I really answered that question.
Great. I think you did great.
Okay.
And you introduced Jen.
For systems, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead with the systems.
The safe space for what we've done. I will say this, I've learned a ton from my colleagues, and I know I came in, I am Mexican, but I grew up in a very white town. And so I know a lot of my culture and beliefs come from where I grew up and being one of the only brown people in my town. And I also saw our organization for a while, really the only people of color that could succeed were ones that grew up in that type of environment that really could code. It wasn't even about code switching. It was about you grew up in more of a white culture as a person of color. And our other staff were like, we don't need to stay in this. And so now I think creating that safe space, our affinity groups have, not been another clear path. They've gone up, they've gone down, who runs them, whoever leads them, you're taxing them because then they have to think about the agenda and facilitating, and that's extra work that doesn't get paid. We thought about having them facilitated by an outside organization. We didn't do that. People show up sometimes, people don't show up sometimes. And so, but that is a place, like I mentioned after George Floyd, like our Black Affinity group, I know that was a place where it was 100% everybody went that day for their group, and that was their space for them to have it. And we didn't need to create anything in the moment. It already existed. And so I believe that's really important. I also believe guiding principles. So we have those in our organization now when we have to use I statements. We have to make space for others to be able to talk. We do, when some decisions are getting made, we do a voting process to make sure everybody's voice is heard, and when there's concerns that we can really take a moment and pause and hear from others, when that often wasn't the way we did it before. If there was the leader or one dominant voice, that was the way we often went.
That's very helpful, Jen. I know we started with the analogy of the marathon, which resonated with a lot of people, and taking into account it is not a sprint. Let's talk a little bit about incremental versus transformational change. Because we have introduced why it's a marathon, how do we then, though, give rightful attention to those individuals within cultures that are pushing and pressing us to go faster, to do more? Mm-hmm. They understand that we need to be thoughtful, but yet at the same time, there's a sense of urgency to bring about immediate change. And so let's talk a little bit about resourcing, right? Whether it's human resources, financial resources. If we are looking at our ability to bring about change, how can we resource things so the change may come at a pace that's a bit faster? And how do we signal to people so that they understand what's behind the investments we're making, right? So that they're able to give us the grace and space to usher in change so that it will be beneficial.
Sure. So when I say it's a marathon, that doesn't mean that you're going slow throughout all of it. Like it's just a long journey. And I think for me, talking about it as a marathon is you're going to be on this for a really long time. And you cannot expect that next year you're going to be able to stand up on the podium and say, we've achieved, we are the gold standard and we're there, if you haven't done anything yet, right? If you are at ground zero, this is a long road. And there's definitely immediate things that you can do. There's an organization I was talking to this morning, actually, where there's considerable question around the leader and I don't even know if it's willingness, but it's understanding of changes that need to be made and some policies that need to be changed. And I think if she took a moment to talk to people and ask their honest questions, the staff will have ideas and suggestions for what can immediately be done. That doesn't necessarily mean a ton of money or major changes. And so I do think like talking to your staff is a really important first step of what are we missing? What's possible? What can we do different? If you're at the top level, you can do that organizationally. If you're even individually as a manager, so when our Black staff came out and said they were having a harder time, I had 3 Black women that reported to me at that time, and I emailed them immediately, and I said, I know I'm part of this problem. I need to know, though, what my role is in this. At our next check-in, plan on us talking about this. So start thinking about what you want me to hear, and I'm there to just listen. And those actions, those immediate actions, are what can drive to maybe some longer term things, but it was the beginning of us moving forward on some bodies of work. Funding, like you can pretty immediately move funding around. I now oversee our finance. And I just was telling my colleague yesterday, we made a decision about some dollars of somebody's salary. And I said, is it that easy? Like, did we just make this decision like that, like in a 15-minute conversation? And we've been having it, but I feel like it needs to be harder, and it doesn't. I think sometimes we create process because we're not quite sure, and like just coming in definitively of we're going to shift some things around. We might need to deprioritize some stuff so we can prioritize this work right now, because this is urgent, and we do need to make some changes, a lot of changes, not some.
Jen, that was very, very helpful. Really appreciated how you introduce positional power. You shared earlier that when you looked at the leadership and the pathway to growth, that it was different for Black people. Want to hear your thoughts a little bit on retention. Mark has shared in the chat box a perspective that when people feel welcome and when they feel respected, they will stay, and they will stay longer. How do we create cultures where people of color, Black people, brown people, indigenous people, how do we create a culture where they feel welcomed and respected? Can you talk a little bit about the inclusive piece of this? Because I think you shared earlier, identifying, retaining is very different than once individuals have been welcomed, that you're creating an equal path for leadership.
Sure.
So can you speak to that for us?
Sure. I'm going to actually do it through something that just happened for us a couple of weeks ago. So we have what's called our management team. So it's our VPs and our C-suite. And so it's 9 or 10 people. And we recently just had to put out a proposal for some funding with this partner of ours. And it was a fast timeline. We had 4 days to get the proposal all complete, or the letter of intent. And the person on development sent it out on a Google Doc to like 6 or 7 people of like, okay, we're in a rush. I need all of these people to be looking at it. And our head of diversity, equity, inclusion, which is not so much our internal work anymore. She's much more focused now on our external work and how we are just being our work has changed, like the delivery of what we do and how we do it as we're looking at systems. And so she's a core component of all of our programmatic work that we do now, her team. Nobody included her in our in that email that was a rush to look at this proposal. This was a $2 million proposal. And so it was an important one, a significant one. And so we were at our management team meeting last week and it came up. And she spoke up and said, I need to tell you something, like, why wasn't I invited onto that document? Like, I am a big part of this work, and how was I forgotten? And so that's exactly right. I think, was it Mark that said, like, how do you feel welcomed and how do you feel safe in being in your environment and respected? That wasn't a very welcoming feeling, right? If you're left off of something, and it may have been an innocent mistake, but those things matter. I think for us, we have worked so hard with one another to be able to have these conversations around feedback, around open dialogue, around like really hard spaces, that she's now able to say, you guys missed really big. I need you to know that. And now that's going to be done differently and better. I know a year ago, we weren't at that place where she was coming up and saying, that was a problem. And so I think it's creating the culture so that everybody can speak and be able to come from their own true, authentic self.
Jen, that's really helpful. Creating norms that enable us to hold ourselves and one another accountable. So thank you for that. As we're nearing the end, I definitely want to ask you to speak to situations and circumstances where communities may not have a lot of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. Is there a place for them in this work? How do you message the relevance, the importance, and how do you persuade people who may not think that this should be a priority for them based upon the racial and cultural composition? How do we change the heads, the heart, the minds of those people? How do we do that? What are your thoughts on that?
That's a really hard question, Tysley. I don't know. I mean, in a facetious response, my thought is like, they're not a good fit. Just like our Black and Brown people haven't been a good fit for a long time. If that's our true North Star of what we're doing and the work that we want to value, it's not a fit for your organization anymore. If they don't believe in the values of the organization and where you want to go, if your values are based around this, you can give performance reviews based off of that. Our values are very much a part of our reviews. And if you can't uphold those, we don't want you to be in our organization because you're not representing what it is that we're trying to do and who we're trying to be. It takes courage, but I mean, we've fired plenty of Black and Brown people because they don't fit. So I'm not suggesting that there's like this mass exodus or firing, but I do say, like, I think you've got to start asking yourselves, like, who do you want in your organization and what do you need? We're also not hiring anymore for people that are at the beginning of their journey. We are far enough along now. We're not starting over with anyone. You need to come into our organization having done work already. And so our interview questions, you can quickly find out who has never thought about this or who actually has been studying this and working on this themselves.
Jen, you've given us some very wise counsel, some tips that we can actually move forward immediately. And I really just want to thank you for sharing your lived experiences and looking in the rearview mirror so that we can learn and that we can all fail forward in this. I think even in our best attempts, there are missteps. And I think if we provide space and grace, recognizing that in order for us to get this right, we will likely disappoint people. We will likely cause aggravation and discomfort. And to your point, you just continue accepting that evolution is before us. And so, Jen, I just want to thank you very, very much for sharing with us. I also just want to end, we had one question that we were not able to get to, and for those of you that are in corners of the country where you feel as if your communities themselves are not as racially and culturally diverse, I always say, let's do our best. We'll share some research from Brookings Institute that speaks to the browning of America. And I think even if your corner of the country has yet to see it, you can get out ahead and rest assured of informing people that tomorrow will look very different than America's yesterday. And that is what you are working hard to prepare your community for, and to work with internal and external stakeholders to ensure that we can continue advancing our philanthropic missions. Jen, I just want to thank you very much.
Thanks, Tysley.
This has been an exceptional time. I'm just going to pause, and I'm just looking at our Q&A and our Zoom to see if there are any closing questions and or needs. Again, we have recorded today's session. We hope that you will share this with individuals within your not-for-profit organizations that can benefit. We invite you to be a part of the exciting work that we have within the Nonprofit Alliance. This is only the beginning. Please reach out to me, to David, to Shannon, share your thoughts, share your perspectives. We will be working really hard over the upcoming months and years to come to create educational program that meets your needs. We thank you for joining us, and we look forward to next time. Thanks again, Jen.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.